What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's episode of Best Bets for UFC Fight Night. Mario Bautista versus Vinicus Oliveira, where I'll be discussing the most confident picks, the lock of the week, the underdog on the week, and some parlays that I like. Let's dive into the most confident picks, where we do have Michael Oleksiejczuk, Daniel Donchenko, and Kyoji Horiguchi. Starting off with Michael Oleksiejczuk, this guy has just been a different fighter ever since he went to the Fighting Nerds. He's looked sharp and he's powerful, and his opponent is chinny. It's a recipe for disaster for his opponent, Marc-Andre Barriault. This fight is almost guaranteed to be a striking battle, and that heavily favors Michael Oleksiejczuk. Barriault has a history of getting knocked out, and his chin looks increasingly unreliable. The more he gets older, he's been slept brutally, multiple times in the UFC. Even though he's landed some nice shots in his last fight, the durability concerns, they're still there. Oleksiejczuk, on the other hand, he's younger, faster, and far more durable. He's never been knocked out in the UFC, and he's coming off of back-to-back first-round finishes. If this turns into a firefight, which it will likely, Michael's speed and his resilience should be the difference maker here. The longer the fight goes, maybe Barriault's pressure could matter, but Oleksiejczuk should just clearly win the early exchanges, and he has multiple paths to victory throughout the fight. So I'm gonna bank on his youth, his speed, and his durability. I expect him to win the firefight, likely by an early knockout. Moving on to Daniel Donchenko versus Alex Morono. This matchup heavily favors Daniel Donchenko. He looks sharp and dangerous in his UFC debut, scoring a first-round knockout and showing speed, power, and killer instinct. And at just 24 years old, he's riding momentum with youth and explosiveness on his side. Morono, meanwhile, he appears to be on the decline, on a 3-fight losing skid, and with a recent first-round knockout loss, he's looking slower and more headable each time out, and there's a massive age difference here. Morono's durability and speed seem to be fading. Morono's only path would be to survive early, grind in the clinch, or slow things down, but Donchenko's explosiveness, it should shut all that down pretty quickly. So I'm gonna say that Daniel's speed, his youth, and just his ability to just be more dangerous. I expect him to get another first-round finish here. Moving on to Kyoji Horiguchi versus Amir Albazi. This matchup strongly favors Kyoji. He's faster, sharper, and far more dynamic on the feet with elite in and out movement, clean counters and constant footwork that make him nearly impossible to just pin down. Albazi is well-rounded and he prefers to wrestle, but getting Horiguchi on the mat should be a major challenge. Horiguchi's resume and form recently, well, his whole career, they speak for themselves. He had a strong first run in the UFC, with his only loss being to Demetrius Johnson, and then it followed by an impressive return in his second debut. He was an underdog over Takir Ulanbekov, and then he gets him out of there as well. I feel like the hype around him is real. Many people see him as a future title challenger, and Albazi, on the other hand, he's been around long enough to show his ceiling. He's had competitive fights, but hasn't looked dominant against top-level competition. And nothing lately suggests he can keep up with Horiguchi's speed or precision. I expect Horiguchi to just have the superior footwork, the superior speed, the striking, and I expect him to keep it standing and clearly outpoint Albazi here. So that concludes the most confident picks. Moving on to lock of the week, Farid Basharat versus Gene Matsumoto. This feels like a stylistic edge for Farid Basharat. He's the more complete fighter. He's going to be faster, he's going to be sharper, and he's extremely well-rounded. Farid manages distance beautifully, makes smart decisions all the time in his fights, and he mixes in takedowns very smoothly to keep opponents guessing. Matsumoto, yeah, he is dangerous with his Muay Thai, and he'll push a high pace early on. But Farid is better at controlling the rhythm. He can slow the fight down, pick his shots as Matsumoto is pressing forward, and he can add grappling to further tilt the matchup in his favor. Right? So Farid's speed, his accuracy, his ability to blend striking with wrestling, it should allow him to consistently land the cleaner, higher volume shots. And Farid is undefeated and he's dominating opponents, while Matsumoto has been scraping by in close fights lately. This matchup favors Farid's composure and his versatility. So I'm going to say Farid Basharat has the superior speed, better accuracy on his shots, and just a more well-rounded skill set to control the pace and just outclass Matsumoto. Moving on to underdog of the week. So Bruno Brazil is more of a value play. There's not many underdogs I like in this card, and in a fight where I'm not impressed by both sides, I think the one who's significantly bigger could have a slight advantage. Again, it's strictly for value. This fight could really go either way, but being the longer and taller fighter, I feel like that could help her in this matchup. So from her being a favorite to now an underdog, I feel like it could have some value. That's all I'm going to say for that one. Moving on to the parlay section. Starting out with the safety lock. Farid Basra and Daniel Donchenko, in my opinion, this is as safe as it gets. Farid Basra, he's going to be the faster, cleaner, and more well-rounded than his opponent, Gene Matsumoto. He'll win minutes, he'll win the exchanges, and just make the better decisions. Pairing him up with Daniel Donchenko is catching Alex Morono at the perfect time. There's a massive age gap here. Alex is declining in durability. He's had a recent knockout loss, and Daniel comes at you like a madman. Minus 180, not the greatest odds, but I do feel it's as safe as it gets here. And then, if you want better odds, just as safe in my opinion, Farid Basra and Kyoji Horiguchi, minus 140 for the ultimate lock. Farid, the lock of the week, he's going to do what he always does. He just controls the pace, lands the cleaner shots, and just mixes in grappling. Pairing him up with Kyoji simply just levels above Albazi in speed, in footwork, and striking IQ. Albazi needs the takedowns. Kyoji, it makes that a nightmare. He's too fast and he's too sharp. So, moving on to affordable juice at minus 110. This is when the odds start to get a little better. Michael Oleksiejczak, he's going to be faster, younger, and far more durable than Barriot in what's almost guaranteed to be a firefight, right? Pairing him up with Mario Bautista, I feel Mario Bautista thrives with chaos and volume. Oliveira gives him exactly the kind of fight that Mario wants almost. Mario doesn't fold under pressure. I feel like he's going to stay composed and just pick him apart for the majority of the fight. So minus 110, decent odds. Now moving on to the 4 most confident picks. A four leg parlay, not the most fun to deal with because you got 4 legs to deal with, but this is a high confidence parlay. You got Kyoji and Michael, they got the speed advantages. Farid and Daniel, 2 skill and momentum advantages here. No one here really needs a miracle. As long as they are themselves, this should hit, right? Moving on to the fun duo parlay. Muin Gafurov and Jailton Almeida, plus 195 for a fun duo parlay. Muin, he's going to be scrappy, he's going to be durable, and he's dangerous against anyone who lets the fight get messy, right? And then pairing him up with Jailton Almeida, I feel like Jailton Almeida is still one of the scariest grapplers in the heavyweight division, right? If he gets on top control, it's usually over, right? Now, going on to Underdog City Sprinkle. Again, a value play here. But Bruna Brazil, she's going to bring the size and physicality advantage, which I feel can help her here. Pairing her up with Claudia Saigula, who's going to be younger than her opponent, Priscilla Cachoeira. And she's facing a fading Priscilla Cachoeira, who's been eating damage for years and comes at you with no defense in mind. I feel like Claudia should be the sharper fighter here. I do think it is worth a small sprinkle, pairing them up together. And that does conclude this week's best bets for this week's UFC card. Hope you found that helpful. Till next time.